Okay, welcome back to the next video in my series on Jalandra Davis, English professor at the University of California, Riverside. For those who have not watched the first two episodes, I will include them in the video description, and I encourage you to check them out so you know where we're coming from. As I've said previously, while this series centers Miss Davis, it's not really about her. The problems that I'm addressing using her merely as a case study are ideological one-sidedness, low academic standards, and a near, if not total, lack of useful skills cultivation offered by many programs in the humanities. I've also discussed areas within the social sciences that share in some of these same issues. It's important to remember that Professor Davis is neither alone, nor is she in any way uniquely or especially culpable for the problems I'm talking about, and as such, she deserves no special criticism. My original plan for this video was to do two things. Firstly, to address the question of her actual belief status with respect to her crossing merfolk narrative, which I'll describe in a minute. And secondly, to dive into what I found to be the most positive aspects of her paper. I've decided that in the interest of video length, I'm going to split these two things into separate videos. I'm going to focus on item number 1 here, and we'll dedicate the next video to the positives. So these two videos, which are included in the interest of fairness, balance, and completeness, actually will focus precisely on Ms. Davis. But before I get into her belief status, I need to issue a correction. In the last video, I claimed that the hoax papers of the Social and Grievance Studies Affairs that were accepted for publication were accepted by top-tier humanities journals. This was wrong. Only one of the journals was top tier. Of the remaining 8, 5 were in the top 25% of publications within their field, so definitely credible and respected, but not quite top tier. Their other 3 were either middling at best or just simply low tier. So apologies for my oversight there. And if you ever think I've gotten something wrong, please let me know. And if it turns out I'm wrong, I'm more than happy to issue a correction. But having said that, it is still incredibly damning of the field that 9 separate journals published hoax papers that were written badly on purpose, though flattering left-wing postmodernist sensibilities. And recall that one of them actually is top tier, and 3 others were, basically near the top of their subdomain. 25%. Now to the question of today's video. Recall that Professor Davis's primary academic focus is the idea that Black slaves thrown overboard of slave ships during the transatlantic slave trade became mermaids. She refers to this idea as the crossing merfolk narrative. Here, merfolk is a gender-inclusive term for, male, female, whatever, mermaids. I have subtly hinted that she does not believe this through my frequent use of words like narrative, lore, and idea. However, my hints were subtle, and some people understandably took it that I was implying that she really does believe this story, and they criticized me as a result. They said it was obvious that she was merely using this narrative as a literary device, and indeed, that's what I figured too. After all, she frequently used terms like narrative and lore to refer to this subject matter. Furthermore, in her University of California Riverside promotional video, she also used terms like whimsy and magic. Moreover, she is actively involved in science fiction, she teaches horror studies, and she's in the English department. So the signs that she's not taking these stories literally are replete. However, I'm going to argue that despite all of this, there actually still was some ambiguity. For example,
one of the things I'm really zeroing in on is this idea of the Middle Passage as the birth of mermaid species, and I call this idea the crossing merfolk.
This statement to me doesn't sound like she's talking about a simple narrative device. And this ambiguity continued into the paper of hers that I read. Interspersed with talk that is explicitly literary, she recurrently invokes evolutionary theory. Is this simply invoking her interests in sci-fi, or is it an attempt to legitimize the idea? Probably the former, but not necessarily. It's not like at any point in the paper or in the UCR video, she explicitly says that this is nothing more than narrative play. Moving on, another major theme within the paper was the recurrent explicit statement that rationality, science, and worldviews that she links with the West should not be prioritized over other ways of knowing, that they should not be placed above African oral culture, for example. This sort of skepticism of rationality and science is a key component of postmodern philosophy. For those who wish to advocate for the less powerful, however, I would argue that it's actually a very bad move to degrade science and reason. To the extent that they are devalued, we risk further elevating the sort of might equals right power mongering that postmodernists and social justice warriors are understandably concerned about and against. Fundamentally, science and reason are impartial to ideology, race, nationality, and so forth. Now, does this mean that they are always used impartially? Absolutely not. But when they're not, the problem is not reason, rationality, or science themselves, but rather how they are being used, and often how they are being used in corrupted ways on purpose. And this brings me to an area in which Davis is absolutely onto something. Western values are dominant. While reason and science are tools for discerning truth, they cannot tell you what questions to ask or what values to try to optimize. With Western values being dominant, though, they are disproportionately steering science and reason. Were Eastern values dominant, scientists would be asking different questions, foregrounding and backgrounding different things, and thus producing a notably different scientific literature. Further, with a different dominant set of values parameters and different, people in power and so forth, different types of research and findings would be emphasized, and they would be interpreted differently too. It's also very easy to misuse science, to interpret the findings in self-serving ways, bury results that you don't like, not ask questions that you don't want to hear the answer to understandably only do costly research if there is profit to be made, so forth. All of these things are valid concerns. Ways to help mitigate these concerns include pre-registration of studies, requiring researchers to report conflicts of interest, and encouraging ideological diversity among scholars so that there is a diversity in the questions that are being asked and the ways in which the results are being interpreted. The solution is not to bring science and reason down a peg.
Look what I can do to Mary Worth's smug sense of self-satisfaction.
That's right, son. Take it down a peg.
But rather to do everything we can to ensure that they deserve the lofty perch that they're on. To the extent that we do away with these things, in addition to facilitating a world that will be even more dominated by power politics, we're inviting the conclusion that a belief is valid simply because a person or a group believes it. This is the complete absence of any sort of intellectual standards. Anyhow, returning, if we are not to put rationality or science over any other way of knowing, and if African oral culture is another way of knowing, doesn't that imply that at the very least, she believes that the crossing merfolk narrative is at least as credible a belief as, say, evolutionary theory? And wouldn't it be what she calls ontological violence for a Westerner to treat this narrative as any less valid than anything that they believe? And given that she thinks that reason and science should be used alongside other ways of knowing, neither above nor below them, how do we know that she's not trying to make a comprehensive case for the crossing merfolk narrative, invoking both oral culture and evolutionary science as evidentiary peers, as she does in her paper? Now, yes, she does recurrently refer to the crossing merfolk narrative as a narrative and as lore, but she also repeatedly tells us not to treat such things as if they were below science. Furthermore, just because something is lore doesn't mean that it's not also true. In pre-scientific, pre-literate times, obviously our ancestors were learning things about the world and were telling each other about the things that they were learning and figuring out. The fact that it wasn't written down or submitted to a peer-reviewed journal does not mean that it was false. Given all this, while I figured that she probably doesn't actually believe in the crossing merfolk narrative as a historical fact, I wasn't totally certain. And as such, I emailed her about it, and here was her very cordial reply to my inquiry. Greetings, Ron. In my work, I am interested in the direct ways that Black artists imagine and depict a narrative of people transported through the Middle Passage, transforming into some form of aquatic life. As a cultural critic, I am interested in the different ways that this narrative explores the relationships between Black people and history, trauma, and ecology. What I call the crossing merfolk narrative is no different than any other recurring narrative or trope or subgenre in science fiction and fantasy literature and film that literary scholars analyze and write about as part of their jobs. Attempting to prove the actual existence of mermaids has nothing to do with my research. While she doesn't explicitly say that she does not believe, I think we can assume that she doesn't. Though, for all I know, maybe she's pulling a Jordan Peterson and refusing to give a direct answer to a direct question.
People say to me, do you believe in God? And I think, okay, there's a couple of mysteries in that question. What do you mean, do?
No, I don't think she's actually doing that. But for clarity, I did send her a follow-up email asking for a simple yes/no answer to the question. If I hear back, I will put the answer in the video description, and I'll make a brief mention of it in my next video. So returning once more, I am totally sympathetic to her statement that the narrative that she is exploring is no different than any other recurrent narrative trope or subgenre in sci-fi or fantasy that scholars analyze. Indeed, as I've said a few times in this series, there is nothing wrong with studying lore. It often does give us insights into human nature, recurring social patterns, wisdom for life, and so forth. And Peterson has demonstrated this repeatedly. Okay, so to conclude, no, I do not believe that she takes this narrative as fact. But there you go. So in my next video, I'm going to do a deep dive into what I found to be the very best about this paper. Thereafter, I'll be inviting a guest to discuss this video project. This person is a very smart, balanced person who has sympathy for where I'm coming from, but also for where Ms. Davis is coming from. And being Nigerian, having read African cultural folklore, as well as original texts from critical race theory and intersectionality, this person can offer insights and perspectives that I cannot. And indeed, he has already had a balancing effect on my thinking on this matter through my private correspondence with him. So I'm going to happily extend an invitation to him to come talk with me about this and fill in any gaps I may have. And of course, I would readily invite Professor Davis to talk with me too, either recorded or not. So if you're looking for more intentionally balanced, constructive considerations of difficult issues, like, subscribe, and if you really do like this kind of stuff, share at will. Thank you.